Good morning. What a terrific looking crowd. I'm Gretchen Crosby Sims. I'm the Executive Director here at the Institute of Politics. We are so pleased to welcome General Stanley McChrystal to campus this morning for a conversation on his new book, Leaders, Myth and Reality. Copies of that book are available for purchase, and he will be signing them after the program. We are also thankful to Cecile Shea of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs for moderating. Welcome back, Cecile. I want to mention just a few upcoming events. Today at 3 o'clock in the IOP living room, we have John Delaney, former U.S. representative and current Democratic presidential candidate, who will discuss his vision for the party and for America. Next Wednesday, Caroline Kennedy, former U.S. ambassador to Japan, will be discussing her career in public service and the diplomatic challenges facing America. You can find out about these and more events at our website at politics.uchicago.edu. A word about audience questions. We will open up the floor to take questions from the audience after the discussion. Please raise your hand and we will be passing around a mic. As usual, we give priority for the first 3 questions to students, and we remind you that a question ends in a question mark. Please do make sure that your phones are on silent, and if you need restrooms, they are on the first floor. Here to formally introduce our guests is Byron Patton. Byron is a second-year law student from Central Lake, Michigan. Before coming to UChicago for law school, he spent 6 years as an officer in the Marine Corps. Please join me in thanking him for his service and in joining us today.
Good morning. The Institute of Politics welcomes, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Our moderator is Cecile Shea. Ms. Shea is a non-resident senior fellow on security and diplomacy at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And prior to this position, she served for more than 2 decades as a United States ambassador, advising countless leaders both here and abroad. Our speaker today is General Stanley McChrystal. General McChrystal has spent a lifetime cultivating and identifying the keys to effective leadership. He served nearly 4 decades in the United States Army, from leading elite teams of special forces as a young captain to the 75th Ranger Regiment as a colonel. As a general officer, he commanded the Joint Special Operations Command, leading our nation's most elite warriors during a critical period on battlefields both within the public's eye and far beyond it. His final assignment was leading the international coalition as head of the International Security and Assistance Forces in Afghanistan. Following his retirement from the Army in 2010, he went on to co-found the McChrystal Group, a consultancy firm whose goal is to enable businesses to build teams capable of addressing the complex challenges of today. General McChrystal's methods are proven, and his leadership credentials are above reproach. And you know, there are a few things that seem to capture our collective imaginations quite like the concept of leadership. Some of the most celebrated figures in our world today are those who have the keen ability to teach, mentor, discipline, and inspire those around them. However, this admiration often comes with a sense of mystery. You know, how is it that some people are seemingly born with the ability to lead while others view themselves almost incapable of reaching those same levels of influence? We ask ourselves questions like, are leaders born? Can they be created? Are there certain conditions or experiences necessary to develop those skills? Or is it that the mystique surrounding effective leadership prevents us from finding our own strength in times of difficulty? Luckily, our guest today will dispel some of those myths and discuss some of the realities of good leadership. So please join me in welcoming Cecile Shea and General Stanley McChrystal.
Well, welcome.
He's good.
He's very good. Welcome to Chicago.
Thanks for having me.
So early in your book, you note that leadership is one of the most misused words in the English language today. So could you give us your definition of leadership? Let's open with that.
Yeah, can I first start just thanking everybody for having me here? And you got this wood panel room. It's intimidating. And you got me against the wall, so it's going to be. A few years ago, I spoke at Oxford, and they take you in a political union, and it's like this, but the place is older than our country. You stay in the green room, and they tell you what an honor it is to do what you're doing. Okay, I'm already nervous. Then as you walk toward the actual entrance to the place where you're going to speak, they stop and they show you a photograph of Teddy Roosevelt speaking exactly where you're going to speak, with the implied message of you are not Teddy Roosevelt. So I sort of enter this with the same kind of trepidation. So I dodged your first question.
Define leadership.
Yeah. Usually it's defined by people as the ability to influence other people to do things they wouldn't otherwise do. Now, there are 200 and some definitions of leadership, and there's a joke among the leadership community that says when you have a conference, you spend day 1 and 2 arguing over what leadership is. And I think that's true. Basically, I would say that leadership is something we don't understand, and it's far more complex than the way we consider it right now.
So I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. The
Yeah.
first chapter of this book is an interesting meditation on your changing regard for Robert E. Lee throughout your life. And I guess my first question on this is, you note that you had a painting, kind of a print of Robert E. Lee hanging in your office at work for a big part of your career, or in a prominent place in your home for the other parts of your career. At this time, you were commanding an awful lot of African American soldiers,
Yeah.
10, 15, 20% of the men and women you were commanding.
Yeah.
What message were you sending to those soldiers?
Yeah, intentionally no message, unintentionally probably sending quite a message. And just so everybody knows this story, I grew up near Robert E. Lee's boyhood home. I now live about 75 feet from it. I went to Washington Lee High School. I went to Stonewall Jackson Elementary School. I went to West Point where Robert E. Lee went. I walked in the same places he went. And at West Point, Robert E. Lee was this figure of incredible reverence. So you have statues to Eisenhower, Patton, all these other people, and they were great generals. And everybody said, yeah, I could be like them. When you talked about Robert E. Lee, you didn't say I can be like Robert E. Lee. He was too good. You could only consider him as this ideal that you could try to guide yourself towards. And I grew up with that reverence for Robert E. Lee. And because he was an apolitical general, just went out and was loyal to the things that were important to him. And then when I was a second lieutenant, my wife, Annie, military bride herself, she gave me this inexpensive painting of him, paid $25 for it, framed. And it was in our quarters every year of our life until about a year and a half ago. And then a year and a half ago, after Charlottesville, she came to me and she says, I think you need to get rid of the picture. And I said, honey, you gave it to me. I can't get rid of it. He's just a general. He just, he did what he thought was right. And she says, no, that may be what you think, and it may be what he thought. But when people come to our house, that may not think that they think, and it may not be the message that you want to send to people in our house. You may be sending an unintentional message that you support something you don't, white supremacy. So we discussed it for a month, and she beat me down. And finally, at the end of the month, I came to the conclusion one Sunday morning, she was right. I didn't do it because she beat me down. I just literally came to the conclusion, she's right. So I took the picture off the wall, took it out to the trash behind our house, and threw it away. And that was an emotional moment because for me, Robert E. Lee had been this penultimate leader. If he was in this room now, he'd be the most impressive person in the room. Charismatic, well-spoken, courteous, courageous, all those things. And he had this extraordinary career, 32 years in the United States Army after graduating from West Point. He went to 4 years at West Point, didn't get a single demerit. I did not do that. But then, and so to me, he was apolitical. He just went with his state, etc. But as I studied it more and I thought about it more, it went into different lens for me. Because in 1861, as a colonel in the United States Army, he was offered command of Union forces, turned it down, resigned from the Army, decided to go with his state of Virginia, essentially gave them his vote. He said, I'll do whatever Virginia does. If Virginia secedes from the Union, I will secede. If they don't, I'll stay. So he gave away his moral decision to the voters of Virginia, who in the heat of the moment, this was during the Fort Sumter period, they voted to secede. He went to Virginia, and then when it joined the Confederacy. Then he fought for 4 years to destroy the United States of America. And he did it to defend slavery. Now, when you suddenly put that out, you say, well, we didn't talk much about that at West Point. We didn't. We talked about all the other things and how well he did on the battlefield and all, but the reality is you can't just ignore that. You have to take it into account. Now, people say, now do you hate him? No, I don't hate him. There's still a lot of things about Robert E. Lee I admire and I wish I could emulate. But at the critical moment of his life, he got it wrong, and he got it completely wrong. And he spent much of the rest of his life trying to justify that. And then, of course, he became this iconic figure in the South. He was raised up and put on pedestals everywhere because he became a symbol that even he didn't want to become. But one of the things that made me do it, it made me think about leadership so much, because here's a guy who was an effective leader. He was a greatly effective leader. Was he a good leader or bad leader? That's a moral judgment I can't make. I know he did something that I think was completely wrong, but I don't think that makes him evil. I think it makes him human. I think it makes him like us, flawed. And I think every leader we look at ultimately has to be looked at through that lens.
So I agree, we're all human and we're all flawed.
A couple of these people are not, but the rest
Well,
of them, yeah.
But it just occurs to me that the difference between Robert E. Lee and Coco Chanel, who's also in your book, and a lot of the other flawed people who are in your book, is some of them are flawed. Patton was a raging anti-Semite, but he saved my father's life. So you can be flawed and still do the right thing, or you can be flawed and not act on your flaw, or you can be Coco Chanel and spy for the Nazis and put your Jewish seamstresses out of work when the Nazis come to power. And so,
Which is a problem.
you know, so how do you balance looking at the leadership capacity of those two people with a decision that was utterly disastrous?
Yeah, first I'd say when we look at leadership and you talk whether they're a good leader or bad leader, that's not the right construct. A leader is effective or they are not. You can be effective and be completely evil. Think Adolf Hitler. He was actually a very effective leader in many ways. He wasn't a great manager, but he was an effective leader. We profile Maximilien Robespierre, and we profile Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq, in our book, both of whom are not people that I think got it all right. But what I think you have is leadership is this ability to interact with followers and the context of the moment. And what emerges from that is leadership. It's really like a chemical reaction. And different things do it. And the reason we looked at this wide span of leadership examples in our book, we have Boss Tweed, we have Martin Luther of the Protestant Reformation, we have Harriet Tubman. You know, we wanted to look very broadly, diversely in fields of work, gender, nationality, etc. And what we find is that it is this ability to connect with the moment and with followers that really separates leaders that we remember now than others. The key thing is it's not just the leader, it's the followers as well, it's us. We define whether a leader actually does that, which means that we are also much more responsible than we want to believe. Leaders don't just show up and they're so great, they're on horseback or whatever, and we follow. The moment occurs, the leaders come with a certain set of skills and attributes, and we as followers come with a requirement. And sometimes that requirement is not even something we understand, it's emotional. They pluck at our emotions, they fill some need we have. Maximilien Robespierre, during the French Revolution, he didn't start the revolution, he didn't guide the revolution, but at the key times of the revolution, he kept it focused on this absolute path, which was pretty extreme, because he told everybody else, this revolution doesn't matter unless we're focused on creating a virtuous society. And then he became so convicted about it, he said that even if we have to commit terror to get there, it's worth it. Now you step back and you go, now you're getting a virtuous society, and yet in a 5-week period, you're going to guillotine 500 or 900 French people. They even had to move the guillotine out of the center of the city because the blood was getting into the water supply. That gets the end justifies the means. So we start to get about leadership. We really got to, in many cases, look back at ourselves.
Yeah. Amos Oz's last book, published while he was alive, is titled Dear Zealots. It's just out. I don't know if you've had a chance to read it, but the first essay in this book is saying, you know, zealots need followers. And so it's time for all of us to start asking ourselves, are we zealots in our hearts and don't even know it? So interesting. But so getting back to leadership and what we need now, I confess when I read this section on Robert E. Lee, I thought you could have been harder on him. I mean, that's my perspective. And I was wondering if other people felt the same. So I looked at all the Amazon reviews, not the professional ones, the reader ones. And it was very depressing because you are being raked over the coals for criticizing Robert E. Lee, saying that you were doing it for political reasons, not moral reasons. And it made me wonder again, who is going to bring our country together on this issue of race? Because if we can't even agree that the Civil War was about slavery or that Jim Crow was wrong, I don't know how we're going to move forward. So who is going to lead us into a better future?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, we are going to have to, because we are going to select, elect, and follow leaders. So ultimately, it's our responsibility. If we stand here and wait for the person with the right charisma and the right values to show up and say, okay, let's go this way, then we're abrogating all our responsibility. That's just absolute foolishness. We have to look in the mirror, decide what our values are, look in the mirror and decide what we are willing and responsible to do. Then the leaders should reflect that. Now, the leaders can help guide us. They can help inform us. They can make us better. They can remind us, because in our daily lives, we get sort of sucked into the reality of it. They can say, no, wait a minute, this is what we're about. But they won't change our values. They will just help, as I say, call to the better angels. That's what I think it's going to take. And right now, what we're doing is we're abrogating our responsibility to do that.
What about courage as a component of leadership? Because I think what is so disappointing to me increasingly is that how few politicians with genuine courage there are out there who will say the right thing, do the right thing, challenge us. After the Rodney King verdict, I remember Bill Clinton got on TV and he said, you need to go have a conversation over coffee with a person of a different race and talk about this. And I did. I mean, and it's the power of the presidency, right? I mean, you can get on TV and ask people to do things and they will actually do them. But where are the men and women of courage these days who will lead our country that way?
Yeah, we punish courage now in many cases, because if you get in front of the parade and go the direction everybody's going, if that's what you truly believe, okay. But if it's not, then is that courage? You know, if you stand up and whether you're on the left or on the right, you get outraged about something, but that's very popular, I'm not sure that's courage. You know, when we wrote the Robert E. Lee part, it took a year to write that one chapter of the book, because there were 6 of us working on the book, 3 primary and then 3 young people, researchers. We just went back and forth. The first version just excoriated him. You'd have thought, you know, he was just a horrible person. And then as we go around, because I grew up with this guy. I mean, I felt like I knew him. And so we're trying to get this very nuanced reflection of where I am on this right now. And I went to a scholar on Lee at the University of Virginia, a guy named Gary Gallagher, and went through all this stuff. He said, here's what's going to happen. 50% of the people are going to hate you for it, and 50% of the people are going to love you for it. And if it's about that balance, you're probably close to right. Me and my wife, Annie, kind of goes, you sure you want to write this? And I said, well, yeah, that's what I think. And so you just, you know, and I don't consider myself a big, courageous person, but you have to stop and just think and say, what is more frightening to me? Is it saying what I truly believe, or is it look at my 2 granddaughters in the eye when they say, why didn't you say what you believed? You know, I got a tweet from the president recently.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm in a very, you know, elite club now of several thousand people. And, you know, I knew I was going to get one. I knew it was coming. So, you know, I had thought about what I was going to say, what I said. And then when it comes, you kind of go, wow. And then you say, well, you know, should I do that? Should I just be quiet? And it all gets back to, at some point, you've got to really stop and think, what's most important to you? And, you know, in that case I did, and I think all of us have got to do that.
So what advice we have a lot of young people here, many of them interested in public service, some of them possibly going into the military or maybe into the foreign service, hopefully. What advice do you give to them about living honorable lives but still making it to first lieutenant?
Yeah.
Right? Because that's the balance, right?
No, that's right. I mean, the first thing is, if you say an honorable life, I've got a set of values, and that's what I'm going to live by. And my response would be, okay, are you sure your values are right? You sure you're all over it? After 2.5 years of fighting against Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, we killed him. And I remember we killed him late one afternoon, and then I stood over his body and looked down. And I wasn't unhappy he was dead, don't get me wrong. But the reality is he believed in what he was trying to do. He was willing to put himself out there. He was willing to do horrific things like personally behead people. So I thought in that way he was horrible. But he was absolutely trying to do what he thought was right. What makes him right and me, or him wrong and me right? And so one of the things I think we've got to do is you've got to have your values and beliefs, and you've got to be brave and stand for them, but you can't be arrogant about them. And you can't be, if you're not willing to change your opinion about some things, then there's real danger there. We just wrote an article, a friend of mine, 2 friends and I, and about the Federalist Papers, and we suggested to people how to think about who to vote for. And one of the 8 pieces of advice we ended up giving was find somebody who's changed their position on something. Not because they're a flip-flopper, but because they are open to new ideas. If somebody came to you and gave you new data and you wouldn't change your position, what does that say? So I think that when I talk to young people is don't be arrogant, don't think you got it right. At age 64, I don't think I got it right.
And I appreciate your honesty with having changed your viewpoint on Robert E. Lee specifically because, as you say, it was 180 degrees different from that with which you were raised and lived for most of your career. The challenge of working in the government in a democracy is the voters surprise you sometimes. Yeah. And I remember being on the BBC being asked to justify extraordinary rendition and waterboarding.
Yeah.
So what do you do? It's tougher if you're enlisted, right? Because you've signed a contract. But what do you do? You know, what does an employee of the U.S. government? How far do they go before they say, "I can't do this anymore.
Yeah.
I have to resign. I can't do what I'm being asked to do anymore."
Yeah, it's a funny position. I think first, if it's not illegal or immoral, you do it.
You do it, or you resign, right?
Well, you can resign, but even the resignation thing, if you don't like a certain thing, you know, the United States has made a policy decision. If every military person had the ability just to resign if they don't want to do something for kind of political judgment, you can't run a country that way because you have to do sometimes things you don't agree with. If it's illegal or immoral, that's a different place. If it's illegal, that's black and white. You don't do it. In fact, you have a responsibility not to do it. If it's immoral now, it's often interpretation. I remember, you know, I wasn't involved in the waterboarding, but I met one of the guys who was in the first group that ran that. And so I had a million questions. I said, well, what was up with that? He says, remember, right after 9/11, we thought we were going to get hit again. We had people like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed who were just incredibly tough. And we thought that this was going to be the new nature of war. We just, you know, there was a sense that we were going to have to do this. When they got the team together, he said the first thing they did was write out a statement of values and wrote it out. And you said, now, wait a minute, this is the team that's going to do that, and you're going to write out, he says, it's never more important than if you're going to do something that is like that. Extraordinarily difficult position. If we all sat here right now and said, would you ever waterboard anybody? I suspect we'd all say no, although my class at Yale, I did this and I gave them the scenario where there's a nuclear weapon in Boston, their family's in Boston, you've got a detainee who you think knows where it is, would you mistreat them? And they all go, yeah, absolutely. And I said, whoa, stop, really? And they literally go, yeah, I mean, you got to do what you got to do. We had a longer discussion, but if we really, it's easy for us to be theoretical about things, but then as you get close to it, the theory gets gray.
And if you believe in constitutional government and the voters have decided on a group of elected leaders, you know, who are you to to turn against that
Right.
at some point. I think it's one of the great challenges at times
Yeah.
in government service.
Exactly.
So can we talk just one moment? Because I think my favorite chapter was Harriet Tubman, because I confess, and it's embarrassing to me as a historian, I had not heard the story of her as a scout.
Yeah.
So could you talk a little bit, because I'm guessing other people have not heard the story of her as an Army
Yeah.
scout. And so could you tell a little bit about this amazing woman?
I didn't know much about Harriet Tubman. She grew up in Tidewater, Maryland. And that was an area where slavery was struggling economically. In the 1850s, 40s and 50s, there was this huge move south because suddenly big cotton plantations were hugely profitable. The richest state in the Union in 1860 was Mississippi. It was like Silicon Valley. But in places like Maryland, you couldn't make that kind of money. So what they found is slaves were not quite as valuable. And so a lot of them were getting sold south, particularly when they got to an age where they weren't as valuable. She was a young African-American woman, about 5 feet tall. And she decided to escape. And so she escaped and she went north. And in those days, you had to go up through Delaware, which is a slave state, then up to Philadelphia, and then really had to get to Canada before you were truly safe. She went up there, and then she went back during the 1850s 13 times back into slave-controlled territory, first to bring out relatives and then to bring out others. She brought about 79 or 80 other slaves out. And when we talk about going back, we're talking about going into the area in the winter, because winter was easier for them to travel and whatnot, going through swampy areas, walking, sneaking at night, all of these kinds of things, really physically tough and hugely dangerous, and then bringing people out with usually the help of what became parts of the Underground Railroad. So she survives this, and she starts to become somewhat known. When the Civil War starts, she goes down to off South Carolina, and she's helping what they call contraband, freed slaves. And she doesn't know the South by experience, but she knows how to scout and whatnot. And so she goes out with Union troops on raids where they would raid plantations to destroy the plantation and to free the slaves and bring them out. And she was the equivalent of a military scout and was revered for it. And she goes through the war doing that, and people really gave her great credit for that. So incredible courage, but also sort of a different kind of leadership skill, not the kind of person who'd stand up and, give the Henry V speech, but a person who, through their quiet competence and courage, accomplishes a lot, and then people start to give credit to African Americans, to former slaves, to females, all the groups that she informally represents.
I would ask you if she would be able to join the Special Forces today, but
I would hope. I mean, she was hard. But then she got to an older age, and she had to go through all of this government bureaucracy to get her pension, which she'd been promised.
There's a story, I think you tell the story about when she wanted the half-price train ticket. And was that in your book, I think? It was somewhere else that I read.
Yeah.
She was traveling on a half-price Civil War veterans train ticket, and the conductor slapped her, basically, and tried to deny it to her, both because she was African-American and because she was a woman, and she just stood up to the guy and wasn't going to put up with that. After just an extraordinary woman. So thank you for including her in this book. I learned a lot. Okay, we're going to open this up to questions now. And if you could, because we are live streaming, if you could please wait until the microphone comes to you. And if you feel comfortable standing, that would help both of us a lot, because there are a lot of people in this room. Any question? Is there one there? Okay.
My name's Ari. I'm a master's student in international relations here. It strikes me that at military academies, cadets for years have been looking up to people like Lee and Napoleon, who were incredible tacticians, but at times flawed strategists, and they ultimately lost. And so that kind of brings up two questions about leadership in general. One, how do you grade a leader? Do you evaluate their effectiveness along the way, and how do you balance that with what they ultimately failed or achieved? And then also, how do you choose which leaders you look up to and who should be serving as your role model?
Excellent question.
I think the first thing is, how do you grade leaders? First, you got to grade them in the context of which they're operating. What is it they need to do? What is it you want them to do? What is it you told them to do? And are they able to do that? Some people get graded extraordinarily harsh during one period of history, and then you wait a little while and they go back up. You look at U.S. presidents do this. Ulysses Grant is going through his high water period, and he'll go back down again. Napoleon, had a lot of problems. He was an extraordinary tactician, and he was extraordinary in changing the government of France. I mean, he put in place some things that just monumental. But then, of course, he put his family in all the positions, and he did a lot of other issues. So I think you have to grade him in that context. So it's hard to get an absolute clear, get a numerical grade for whether somebody was good or bad. And then you've also got to give people, you've got to understand that the context often allows it. None of us would know Abraham Lincoln's name if we hadn't had a Civil War. I mean, he's a great guy, but the moment demanded things of him that came out that might not have been demanded or probably wouldn't have been demanded during another period. When you're trying to look for leaders, it's harder to do that. I mean, it's harder to look at young leaders or old leaders and say, okay, what kind of a leader are they going to be? Because as we've seen in the case of presidents or other people, people grow and change in the job. My personal feeling is what we should, don't go to a senior leader and say, okay, what's your position on this, 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 and this? Because those are kind of relevant in reality. Things are going to change. You're really trying to look at how do they make decisions? What's the process they use to make decisions? What are the values that those decisions are based on? What's their ability to build a team and therefore harness the capability of all the people around them? Those are the things that I'd say if you get those right, the person's probably going to get pretty good outcomes absent, with them having personally the exact right answer.
And don't you think knowing yourself? So, I mean, you're either a strategic thinker or you're a tactician, or you're good with people or you're not so good with people. And so then you need to surround yourself with the folks who fill in the holes a little bit, right?
You really should. But look at our current political world.
Yeah.
That on the one hand, you say you should know yourself, you should be humble, but we don't select humble leaders.
That's true.
Because even CEOs.
Not recently.
Yeah, and in politics, you got to go sell yourself for 2 years. How are you going to come out of that humble? Adlai Stevenson said, the challenge of the U.S. presidency is doing what it takes to get elected and still being worthy of the job. That's an interesting thought. And so, how you square that.
Interesting. Yeah. Thank you. Someone back there? Yes.
General, thanks so much for being here. It's an honor to see you.
It's mine.
So, when you were in Afghanistan, what's an example of a tough decision that you had to make? And in hindsight, do you feel that the decision you made was the right one?
Yeah. There were a lot of tough decisions, and a lot of them I got wrong. The one that I thought that I feel, or one that I would talk about that I feel really good about, was our decisions to change how we use force. When I went into Afghanistan, we'd been there for 8 years. I'd been there a lot, operating in special operations, but now I'm in charge. It's different. We were killing Afghan civilians at an incredible rate. Not intentionally, but there'd be an airstrike and Afghan civilians would be killed. And first we'd deny it. We'd say, no, we didn't do it. Or, no, it was bad guys. And then the Afghans would go, no, it's civilians. And we'd investigate it and we'd go, yeah, it was a mistake. Sorry about that. And there was a school of thought that says, hey, we're here fighting a war, and the Afghan people ought to be very appreciative that we are here spilling our blood to fight the war. On one level, that makes sense. But on another level, if you go to a country and you say, I'm here to defend your country, to protect you, to give you a better future, and you may die in this process, they go, well, I'm not as appreciative of that. And after 2001, they had seen us use air power, and you probably know this personally, with devastating effectiveness. So they thought we were omnipotent. We had eyes in the sky, and they thought we were kind of infallible, hit exactly what we want. Then they find out no, and they think that, well, you're either not as good as you thought you were, or you're cavalier and you kind of don't care. Afghan civilians don't matter that much. So what we did is we tightened up what you call rules of engagement, and that's the guidance to the force. And we got a lot of pushback. You know, we said, okay, I don't want you to use artillery or air power unless you have to use it to protect your
Pushback
force.
from commanders in the field, or
No, mostly from people in the United States.
from armchair quarterbacks?
Yeah, we got some from people in the field, but much less than you'd think, because we talked to the force and we explained it. And they're up close, and most of them kind of get it. Not all of them,
yeah.
but most of them. People back in the States go, my daughter, my niece, my son, whatever, you're putting them at risk because you're tying their hands. They're out there, you know, and you're tying their hands. You're not letting them fight the war we need to fight. And my response was, and they started saying that, you know, McChrystal has gone weak. You know, I'd been in the counterterrorist world where we killed a lot of people, and people were disappointed that now I'm giving a message, let's not kill a lot of people. But my response was, forget morality. There is a moral argument here, and I feel strongly about it, but that's not the basis for this. The basis is, if we don't win the support of the Afghan people, we lose the war. If we kill the Afghan people, we don't win their support. Therefore, if we don't conduct ourselves in a way that wins their support, we lose. You know, it takes a little while for people to collect those dots, but most of the force did. Afghan people did. I mean, there was, you know, no doubt about it. But it's, you know, Americans sometimes like to think war is an event. You know, you go to war on Saturday and you hopefully win by Saturday night. War is a process. It starts with reasons for it. It goes through an entire process. And then it has this almost like afterglow after it that, you know, continues on. And that entire thing is really, really important. And so you can't just go in and swing a hammer and fight a war. War is largely political and social. The military part's a subset that we just happen to focus on.
Mm-hmm. Interesting, thank you. Yeah, we have a quick person, a couple over here.
Hi, my name is Grace. I'm a second-year student here studying public policy. You've talked before about how followers can often be disappointed in seeing the kind of true lives of leaders. I was wondering, do you think leaders are obligated to show their true lives or their kind of more human side, even if that's not part of the job, the role, or the goals? And as a leader, is this something that you do?
Yeah, that's a great question. Whether they're obligated or not, it's hard to say. Nowadays, I don't think they have as much choice. There was a period in which you could wall off your life. You know, people knew that John F. Kennedy was Mattress Jack as a politician in the 1950s in D.C. Everybody knew that. People knew, the press all knew that Franklin Roosevelt was crippled. There were all these things people knew about leaders that was not pumped out, you know, widely. I mean, a lot of people knew in most of those cases. So should the leader just bear everything? I don't think so, but at the same time, the level of scrutiny we have now almost bears everything anyway. And so we may get to the point where you're just absolutely ripped asunder for the process. The downside of that is very few of us welcome that. Very few of us want to put our families or other people through the pain involved in that. And so we're having a lot of talent not pursue positions where that's the game. And there are people who don't care. There are people in politics who don't care. And there are other people in different walks that profit from it. So they're happy to do that. The greater good, you can take a good politician, you can rip them to pieces, and you won. Even if you're just, you know, media or someone on one of the sides. And the nation's lost that person's talents. And you say, well, yeah, but that's the way the game's played. We're going to have to figure out a new solution. I don't know what it is.
That somehow allows people to be human, but that also provides the voters with the information that they deserve.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the voters deserve to have a sense of the person. Do they deserve to have knowledge of every single thing in a person's life? That's hard.
When the Marine Forces Pacific Sergeant Major retired, one of the most amazing moments of leadership I've seen for his speech with, I don't know, 5,000, 10,000 enlisted behind him. With tears in his eyes, he talked about his struggle with PTSD.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was so incredibly courageous of him as a leader, because there are times where you do have to admit that something is a struggle, isn't it, when you're in charge?
Sure.
Just to set the, you know,
Sure.
yeah, not to die that we're, everyone is
Yeah.
human. Yeah.
Absolutely.
We had this gentleman with the red jacket has had his hand up for a while, so.
Hello, thank you for sharing your wisdom. My name is David Holmes. I'm a guy who's just curious about history and the flow of it. And if you could, right now, if you could visit your younger self before enlistment, what would you say?
Yeah.
Good question.
And this is going to sound kind of personal and whatnot. I asked my dad when I was just graduated from West Point. My dad had gone to West Point, and he had retired a year or so before. And he had some problems before he retired. And I said, what would you do differently? He says, I wouldn't work so hard. And I said, well, it's easy for you to say. You were a general. You made it. You're saying it that way. He says, no. Mark my words, I wouldn't work so hard. I left the service, and you talk about the things you regret. I have very few things I did that I truly regret. I mean, there's some boneheaded stuff I did that, all right, I wouldn't do it again, but I don't deeply regret it. The things I deeply regret are things I didn't do. Things I didn't, I was always too busy to spend time for my wider family. I have a wife I've been married to for 42 years and one son, and we were a nuclear family, and I spent all my free time with them, but the family wider than that. I've got 5 siblings, and I didn't pay them any mind once I got older. My wife's got 5 siblings, and they're still very close. And there are just so many things I didn't do that you can't do over. It's going to a family reunion. It's going to a wedding. I mean, I always had a reason. I'm working this. But if I could tell my young self to get the balance better, I would definitely do that, because, again, you can apologize for it later, but you can't make up for it.
We'll do this one, and then we'll come back to that side.
Morning. So my question is also about going back. If you had the chance to go back just after 9/11, and you had all the knowledge that you already have about how the war on terror developed, what things you will do differently if you were in charge of making those decisions and also applying the strategy?
Yeah, this is sort of my fantasy. 9/11 was an incredibly visceral moment. If you watched, and if you haven't done it recently, we're very judgmental about what we did after 9/11. We're very critical. Go back and watch the footage. Watch couples jumping, holding hands. Suddenly it's back in the moment. But now, knowing what I have, I could go back. On the 12th of September, the first thing I'd do is I wouldn't do any sudden movements. I would, as the leader of the nation, I would bring people together. I'd say, okay, we got this problem. Problem is extremists, and terrorism is personified in Al-Qaeda, and we are going to have to deal with it. But the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take a year, and this first year we're going to travel around to our allies, build our relationships, and as the aggrieved party, we're going to try to build a consensus for international action against Al-Qaeda. But for a year, I wouldn't attack them, I wouldn't bomb them, I wouldn't do that. One, it would freak them out because they expect you to be coming. But second, give ourselves time to clear our head, think about it, and to get ready for what we really want to do. Discuss it, get everybody's input. In the military, I would have sent 10,000 young people to Dari, Pashto, and Arabic. And I would have spent the year getting them fluent in it. And I would have started building up my foreign services. I would have started building up all the things you're really going to need if you are going to try to change the dynamics in a region that is being under upheaval by extremism. And I would say I'm not going to do anything for a year. I'm not sure if I'd say it publicly, but I'd give ourselves the year to make some mistakes, get a lot of things done so that when we did act, we thought about it. When we did act, we had some kind of clear sense. We'd have still made mistakes, but I think we could have been so much more prepared. And if we think about what we've done after 9/11, in many cases, we've sort of bounced our way along trying to make decisions here and here and here. And many of them could have been a lot better. Now, can we do that in a political environment after a big problem like that? I don't know. It would have been hard, but actually, if something like that happens again, I would hope we would take at least some version of that and try to do it.
We might have even been able to get the Taliban to act against al-Qaeda, and then we wouldn't have had to go in at all.
That's exactly right. I mean, there's so many things we probably could. You remember the Iranians initially supported us? The Russians initially supported us? Right. Just try to build on that. See where it goes. Sometimes it won't go very far. But wait and see. You know, pull on it a little bit. A year's not that long. And we could have done a lot of things to get ourselves more ready.
Excellent answer. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Parag Patama from Indianapolis, and I'm just wondering if in your book or in your writings, if you've talked about the role of spiritual leadership in promoting or preventing the cycle of violence that frequently occurs in terrorist acts.
Yeah. Well, we don't talk about it in that vein, but we address it in the part on Martin Luther, Protestant Reformation. He didn't start the Protestant Reformation. He sort of gave a face to it and helped move it along. But particularly during the Peasants' War, he took a strong position actually against the peasants. But so the spiritual leadership becomes very important because many populations are just deeply spiritual, and you can get people to do or not do things by using a spiritual argument for them. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., to a degree, he used basic morality, secular morality, but he also was based in, a religious tradition. He was a preacher. His family had been that, and the glue that held the African-American population in the American South together was the church. And so he leveraged the spiritual sense of that, the sense of belonging and whatnot, to go without making the civil rights movement contingent upon a certain, just a single interpretation of religion. Then you, of course, go to Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. He uses religion in a very focused way. You are either a good Muslim or you are not a good Muslim. And if you're not a good Muslim, you have to be killed. And he played guilt on people. There was this sense that if you're not a good Muslim, you are wrong. You're not just a little flawed, you are completely wrong. And therefore, he got a lot of young people to come and participate in suicide acts and in fighting and whatnot because he reached out to their obligation as Muslims. You are letting down your God and your religion. So the spiritual part becomes, it's a powerful tool. It's a little bit like patriotism or nationalism. You can judge it positively or negatively, but it really is a powerful thing that binds or motivates people. Thank you.
And is it possible to use spiritual leadership and not endanger the members of minority faiths or atheists?
It's dangerous because if you use it in a very specific faith way, they automatically feel as though they aren't part of that. Mm-hmm. And so, you can have sort of the onward Christian soldiers thing, which other people can feel, well, wait a minute, I'm not Christian. Mm-hmm. How does that apply? So I think you got to be really careful about that. I think I personally am more comfortable when you go back to basic values, many of which are consistent across most religions, the sense of responsibility and things like that.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Yang. So leaders often tell lies, sometimes strategically or even telling noble lies. So what is your opinion on leaders telling lie? And in this digital age, what do you think the part it plays in the low public trust in many of the institutions in the government?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to start sort of the historical standpoint. Abraham Lincoln told some things that were not true. Franklin Roosevelt, of course, was often dishonest to people to their face to try to maneuver things, but they were sort of micro liars. They weren't macro liars, and I don't know that that's, I may be drawing this too far, but in reality, there's sort of the larger lies that I consider more dangerous. I think leaders have a moral responsibility with their followers, and that moral responsibility, followers are kind of hardwired to follow you, particularly in the military. You get in front of a bunch of troops and you say something, they are default gonna believe you, particularly if you are a trusted leader who's led well before and they think you believe in them. And so you have this incredible power. It's like your kids. You know, when they're 4 or 5 years old, you tell them something and they go, all right, they don't know better, so that must be true. Lying to the people you're responsible for, lying to the people you're responsible to has first, a moral component that really worries me an awful lot. And then second, if you start to lie as a matter of course, what you do is you cheapen discourse because people, they respond over time to their experience and they start saying, well, he may or may not be telling the truth this time. And you've got people you know that when they tell you something, you check it before you believe them. And you've got other people who tell you something, you just take it to the bank. If a leader so devalues what they say that it doesn't carry weight, it's like our currency, our money. You go to the store and people go, I don't take it anymore. Think what that does to our economy. Well, think of what that basic dishonesty does to our political process. And so I think it's one of the most important things that we need to address. And we've gotten a little bit cavalier in saying politicians lie. Or, you know, you joke, how do you know when a politician's lying when their lips are moving? I mean, there are all those things. That's concerning. Because even when we go back and we say, you're lying, and they go, yeah, I was. If we accept that, then we're just in a new place. And I think it's a big problem. So I don't have the perfect solution for that because lying does seem to pay. If you tell lies right now and you tell them loudly enough, often enough, and you hammer the same ones, there's a certain positive outcome to it. But I'm not comfortable with it.
Walter Mondale famously promised the next president would raise taxes and probably lost for that reason.
Yep.
And then the next president raised taxes, but it wasn't him. So I think there was a lesson, you know, we say we want honest politicians, but then we punish them sometimes when they tell the truth.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, you know, you can't say certain things. I imagine, I'm not a politician. There's certain things you can't say. Now, there's some funny paradoxes. You know, as a senior military commander, there was a funny case where, you know, you're put in charge of something and someone says, how's the war in Afghanistan going? Can you win? And people say, General McChrystal, I want your absolute honest answer. Okay, well, I can sit in front of Congress and I say, well, it's looking tough. I don't know. And I've got 150,000 troops going, WTF. They have to believe. You have to believe. So there's a paradox there. You know, leaders who are trying to do difficult things have to believe they can do it. The organization has to believe they can do it, or it's self-defeating. But it's always a tension.
Point. Thank you. Yeah, we have another one, did you say? And then we'll come back over this side.
I just finished General McMaster's book, Dereliction of Duty. Do you have a comment on that book and on General McMaster's, who I think couldn't make general because of positions he took? And could you also talk a bit about General Petraeus and the generals back at the time of the Vietnam escalation, who the book was about? General Wheeler, the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
So it'll have to be a quick answer because we're running out of time.
Yeah, I'm not going to slam them all. H.R. McMaster is a friend of mine. Dave Petraeus is a friend of mine. So, you know. And H.R. did make 3 stars, so you know, his positions didn't hurt him that much. His book, Dereliction of Duty, is about the early years of the Vietnam War and the basic tension when the Joint Chiefs of Staff believed that America needed to put more forces in the war and then didn't basically hold their position. So the title refers to what he thinks is if they felt so strongly about their position, they should have resigned or they should have taken other actions to do that. My father-in-law was the executive officer for the Chief of Staff of the Army during that period. And the Chief of Staff of the Army was a Bataan Death March survivor and a Korean War veteran, so he wasn't a non-courageous guy. One evening, about 7 o'clock, as they were still working, the general ordered up a car, and he says, I'm going to the White House to resign. And he got in the car while my father-in-law waited at the Pentagon. He drove to the White House and then had the driver drive around it, drew back to the Pentagon, and said, I have a responsibility to stay here and do the best I can. Just resigning is not. Now, whether that's the right answer or not, these guys went through this incredible conflict. How much do you fight? When do you stand for what you believe and whatnot? And so it was pretty interesting. HR wrote that, and I read it as a young officer. We all read it because it really was a brilliant sort of reminder to us what our responsibility is. And then when I was a general officer and I was in the Pentagon, I saw a lot of the same things. And it wasn't because all these people are weak, the generals and whatnot were weak. I saw Dave Petraeus absolutely speak his mind straight to people. I saw H.R. McMaster. But when you are in the room and you are trying to get an outcome, it's harder than it seems. Mm-hmm. It's more complex. And you don't know the exact moment when you're supposed to slam the table and say, that's it, I resign. Or when you're supposed to be a team player. How do you know you're 100% right? It's harder. But that's why it's so important to read books like that, because I remember sitting in the Oval Office with the president and a bunch of people thinking about what H.R. McMaster had written when I was negotiating with President Obama for more forces for Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And I'm trying to think, okay, where am I coming out on this? Am I doing the right thing? You know, how much do I stand my ground and whatnot? So I urge everybody, it's worth a read.
Yeah, it is. It's a great book, and HR's a great guy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fabulous guy. Can someone ask this question in 5 seconds? I mean, seriously, because we're down to 50 seconds here.
Sure. General, thank you for your service. How do you build trust? How do you get the Afghan people to trust you, your troops to trust you, and then back at home, how do you build trust?
People trust things from experience. If I ask you what you trust, you'd say your family, your friends. I'd tell you McDonald's. And you go, I don't like McDonald's. You trust it because when you go there, you know what you're going to get.
It's always the same.
And you know what it's going to cost. So you have to execute it. I think you have to show trust in people, but you have to build up experiential interaction. That's where true trust comes from, which means it's hard to trust someone you never interact with. Mm-hmm. So you have to try to create opportunities and requirements to interact a lot.
Supervisors, you're going out in the world of work, supervisors go to their trustworthy employees, right, on the big assignments.
Of course.
Because those are the ones who haven't let them down.
Of course.
So I think that's excellent advice and a good example.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for being here. I've learned a lot. I hope that all of you have too. And thank you for your lifetime of service.
No, thank you for having me today. I'm honored.
And you're going to be signing books, I understand. Is that correct? Yep, it's right out here. Right outside. So if you want to stay around for a while and talk to the general, he'll be here. Thank you again.
Thank you again.
Thank you so much.